You've heard about Little Red Riding Hood? Yeah? You know about Snow White? Of course you do. And Rumpelstiltskin? Yeah, you know all about him. Or do you? Well, do you? Hello and welcome to the Friday Fantasy Show from the Bottled Imp, exploring the realms of fantasy. My name is Ken Boyter and today we are looking at Grimm Tales by Philip Pullman. And this was published in 2012 by Penguin Classics. Now some of you are thinking, hang on, Philip Pullman, Grimm Tales, is this anything to do with the Brothers Grimm? Well, yes it is, because Penguin Classics, they asked Philip Pullman, who is obviously a well-respected and well-loved fantasy writer, he did his Dark Materials amongst other things, they asked him to curate, it's going well, curate 50 Brothers Grimm stories out of 200 that's in the collection. So are they any good? Well, let's find out. Grimm Tales. Now, I'm always fascinated by the brothers Grimm, and their idea of going around collecting folk tales. That's what they did. And I actually suddenly realised I've not read sort of the original stories. I haven't picked up a collection of their work. I know of the stories, obviously, because, you know, they've been retold and made into animations and live action films and, you know, copious amounts of books, you know, written by other people that have adapted them and changed them. And I suddenly thought, hang on, wouldn't it be nice to go back to basics and really just read a purer version, you know, the unsoiled version, if you like, the unchanged version. It was that idea that led me to this, that and the fact that I had forgotten my book that I was reading at the time, and I was going on a train journey and I needed a book to read because I like reading on train journeys. So I kind of grabbed this one. But it then did start me thinking about, I never actually have read the original tales. Now, as I say, Philip Pullman did curate this. Again, I said it badly as well. 50 stories. I didn't know there was 200. Now, the Brothers Grimm collected the stories over a number of years, so they kept adding and maybe doing different types of the story, and they kept changing the stories. What he's done here is he has tried to look at the various different versions over the years, and then he has picked what he thinks is the best version, and he's kind of rewrote them, is what I can gather. And I'll quote from the book here. It says, and this is Philip Pullman, they are not all of the same quality, with some are easily much better than others and some are more obvious classics. Now you're going to get that. Any collection of short stories or novellas or whatever, there are going to be some that are better than others. And that's true of any author, a single author that writes, you know, say 20 books or 30 books in their career, there are going to be some that are better than others. That's not to say that you don't necessarily like the other books. It's just that you're going to have some of the stories that work better. Now, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, otherwise known as the Brothers Grimms, they were born in the 18th century, just to put all of this in context. And they were lots of things. They were German academics, they were philologists, they were cultural researchers, they were lexicographers, if I can say that word, and obviously they were authors. And they started specialising in collecting and publishing folklore during the 19th century. Now, they weren't the only ones doing that. There was a big kind of surge and interest in doing that. But for some reason, their one sort of became the gold standard. And they popularised already existing known folk tales that, you know, that were probably passed down via word of mouth. And they popularised them and turned them, I guess, into what we would now call, you know, classic folk tales. So you've got stories like Cinderella, the Frog Prince, the Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. And the first collection of their folk tales was actually called, and I love this title because it's a bit unusual, Children's and Household Tales. There you go. It's quite simple, it's quite to the point. You know, it's not necessarily a title that we would choose today because it doesn't really evoke sort of exciting and wild and amazing adventures. And that was published in 1812. So that's putting it in context there. So it's over 200 years now. Wow. So it's amazing to think that some of these stories, or a lot of these stories, survive and they're read and reread and retold in various different media today. Now, the first thing to note is that there is an introduction by Philip Pullman, and he details the history and origins of the stories, quite briefly, obviously, and he doesn't go into all of them because, as I say, there are 50. And he does give you a little bit of a history about the Brothers Grimm, which obviously, again, is good to know when you start reading it. Now, I didn't read the introduction first. I just jumped straight into the first story. And the reason why I did that, as I say, I started reading this on a train and I just wanted to get to the meat of this. Now, I do recommend that you read the introduction first because, again, it puts it in context. And, if this is your first introduction to reading these folk tales, because obviously I would imagine a lot of people come to these stories via Disney or other animations or live action films, then I would recommend reading the introduction because, again, he puts it in context and he gives some really brilliant insight into these stories and into the mindset of the Brothers Grimm. He also analyses the function and purpose of folk tales, which is a really interesting subject, and it's one I want to research more about, the origins of folk tales and why we've created them, the human psyche. And again, I'd love to do episodes on that, so maybe that's one for the future. Anyway, also in the introduction he mentions a book, and the book is called The Types of International Folk Tales. Now, I didn't know this existed, and this really fascinates me because it's an index, it's a really big index of folktale types. So it was originally compiled by Antti Arni, I think that's how you pronounce it, and that was published in 1910. So he has actually taken folktales and analysed them and then put them into types, which really fascinates me. And if I do writing as well, obviously, and there are only meant to be like 12 actual story types that you can tell. Everything else is just a reworking of one of those story types. So the actual nuts and bolts of writing fascinates me. Now, this book must be out of print because when I searched for it, I think, that'd be good to get and read. Cheapest I could find, it was £80 to £500 a copy. So obviously, if you do have a copy, I'd be interested in reading it. Anyway, the book itself is a good mixture, as I say, of well-known and lesser-known folk tales. The known ones, obviously, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, Snow White, Rumpelstiltskin, and a few more that you will instantly recognise. But there are a healthy dose, and more of them are lesser known anyway, they were to me, such as Hans My Hedgehog, The Singing Bone, The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs, Strong Hands, The Fisherman and His Wife. Now, there's loads that are really good in this. I really did enjoy this book. I'm just going to say this straight up. Because it's something that we're so familiar with already, yet I felt like I was going back to its roots and really getting like a purer version. And even tales that I knew already, like Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, there were things in there that was like, oh, okay, that's happened? Yeah, this is really interesting. So what's happened is that when people retell it or animate it, or they do a live action version of it, they will change it. These classics have been changed, and normally, if they've thought that these are for children, they've sanitized them, they've diluted them, they've watered them down, and I guess that comes into cultural tastes. But I was really interested in keeping, in reading what was actually taken out as much as what was kept in, because these are darker, a lot darker than you actually would think. And for me, that's really interesting, really find that fascinating, and it works. If these are meant to be morality tales or tales that have messages and you're meant to learn from them, then having them really dark, if you're trying to scare somebody off, behaving a certain way, or don't go in, don't go into the woods because bad things can happen to you. You've got to kind of show what bad things actually happen in order to create that fright and that fear. That's just one example. The other great thing about this, you can just dip in and out of this because obviously they're short stories and they're not related to each other. So you could just go, right, I want to read all the ones I know already, or you could just dip in and out and go, I'm not interested in the ones I know already, although I do recommend you read those because, as I say, there are extra bits in there that you may not know. And so you can kind of just dip in and out of this. You don't have to read them in order. And there's a good lot of variation in these tales, but obviously they all share common things. That's the best way I can put it. There's loads of different themes, as you can imagine. There's 50 different stories. Now, a lot of them do cover the same sort of theme, and there are variations on it, but there are a good different amount of themes in there as well. Some are obvious that you get instantly, and some are more hidden, more obscure. And the same with the messages and the lessons that you're trying to, that they're trying to teach you. So I'm just going to go through some of the themes. There's trust. In quite a few stories about trusting. Who should you trust? Should you trust the appearance of somebody? In like Snow White, for example, Snow White encounters the sort of old lady. Should she trust that person? And all is not what it appears to be. There's things like one's true nature, about looking into yourself and knowing what your true nature is, and resisting temptation or resisting being corrupted by the outside world. There's greed and the consequences of being too greedy. So the fisherman and his wife covers that, but again, a few other ones cover that theme. There's also jealousy, and the step family crops up as a recurring theme as well. And can you trust, or are you jealous? It's normally the step sister or the stepmother that's jealous of the family, so in other words, they're the outsider. So for example, in the Jupiter tree, there's that jealousy theme that runs through that one. The other thing they have in common is obviously they have traits and structure of a folk tale, and it normally concentrates on the story and the actions of the protagonists rather than too much character development. You don't know too much about these characters, and I guess there is an argument that they're not well-rounded characters, but that's not the point of these stories. The story is to pass on a message or to learn something from them. And yes, there is character development, but nothing to the extent that you'd find in a novel. And I guess that's got to do with the length of the writing as well, because some are short, some are shorter than others. I think there's one that's just a one-page one, which is really snappy, but just succinctly does what it's set out to do, and I think that's the best that you can do. Every single one of these is very economical in terms of the way it's written, and I guess that's maybe got to do with Philip Pullman as well, because obviously he's edited these as well, and he's maybe improved it. And so you get, some do flow better than others, but then I guess that's the structure as well of the story. So they do have this folk tale feeling to it. There once was a man who, or there was a soldier who, and they kind of set it up in a certain way, once upon a time. Not all of them start like that, but you kind of know when you read the first sort of paragraph, you're in folk tale mode. And so I guess because you're familiar with the folk tales, or the premise of how it works, you can overlook some of the sort of less character development, because it's more about the actions and the consequences of their actions and how they react to things that happen to them, and also obviously the messages and the lessons that are to be learned. Now, yes, some are better than others, but even the ones that were a bit weak, I still found fascinating, because the imagination of these stories is amazing. There's various things that can happen. You think, I wouldn't have thought of that. And just so, I love the fantasy element in this, because you're never quite sure what is going to be fancy and what isn't going to be fancy. You could have a character and they're walking along and they, see an old lady, and then suddenly she transforms into a swan or something like that, or they're feeding the ducks and then they transform into a prince. I love all that. It's just, nothing needs to be explained. The fantasy doesn't have to be explained, and fantasy doesn't have to be explained. It just is. Magic is alive and it works, and I love that. And so for me, it's taking, it's trying to find the magic in the everyday. That's what I try to do in my life. Try to find that magic, and it is there. You just have to know where to look. So I did take delight in every story, even though there were some that were my favourites, that were, I felt, flowed better as a story and actually had they got their message across in a better way. And I also like the fact that, like I said, I'm reading the classics that I already know, like Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, all of those stories, that there were always a few little extra nuggets that I didn't know, and that's what I wanted out of this. I wanted to, to peel back all of the layers that these stories have gathered over the last 200 years. And peel back the sort of sanitized version. Now, it did also remind me, it was great, there were a few stories that I did recognise that were lesser known, but I did recognise them because of The Storyteller. Jim Henson's The Storyteller, which is a TV programme that came out, I think it was the 80s, early 90s, 80s. And we have done a review of that as well, so you can check that out on our YouTube channel. And I absolutely love what they've done there, these folk tales. And even then there were some discrepancies, so even Jim Henson altered them because maybe they thought they could improve the story. Hans My Hedgehog was one, which I did think Jim Henson did improve. Absolutely loved the whole book, the whole concept of this, because there was a real delight to discover the lesser known ones. And some of my favourites were The Fisherman and His Wife, The Girl with No Hands, great title, The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs, I particularly liked as well. And there were loads more that I really liked that were lesser known. What I also liked about this was that at the end of each story, Philip Pullman actually does, maybe half a page, maybe a page about the story. So he gives his opinion of it, and he's not praising every single one. He does say this one could do with a bit more tidying up, or the structure wasn't quite right, it didn't quite flow, and then he kind of tells you if he was going to write it from scratch, how he would do it. So again, getting an insight into a writer's mind was really fascinating. And then, he also did say about, there was 2 or 3 different versions that he could have used. So, there would be bits in the story that were different. And he decided to go with one particular version because he felt it worked better. And he'll give you his reasons why he picked that one. So I really did enjoy this, absolutely loved it. As I say, you can dip in and out. Some were shorter than others, so it was good variation in length of story. You didn't get bogged down with a sort of particularly, rhythm that everyone was 20 pages long, whatever. It was great in that sense. I loved the fact there was these insightful thoughts from Philip Pullman at the end of each story. I almost wanted to read them first, as I got through the book, but then I didn't. I resisted because I didn't want to spoil the actual story. And also, he does talk about the classics in a way that it was very insightful as well. And he seems to have a vast knowledge of folk tales and folklore as well. So he draws on other people that have talked about folk tales as well. In a way, these are like the unplugged version, if you like. They're the unwatered down. Does that make sense? They're the filtered versions. Now, my next thing would be then to go back and try and get hold of the original, I don't know, obviously not first edition, but the actual, Brothers Grimm Children and Household Tales, because it'd be interesting then to see, hopefully they'll be as they were first published, because that would be brilliant to see the real pure stories as they were recorded. Now, the Brothers Grimm obviously went round and they talked to people who then told them the story, and they might have heard the same story but slightly different, because that's how stories work, don't they? If they're word of mouth, you change them. A storyteller will embellish each time, and that's what I love about this, just soaking yourself, immersing yourself in storytelling, because after all, life is all about stories. So I can definitely recommend Grimm Tales by Philip Pullman. Grimm Tales by Philip Pullman. Yes, I can totally understand why here it says the Sunday Times Fiction Book of the Year. A delightful book. Immerse yourself in these folk tales. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. We have other book reviews, and also we've got other fantasy board game reviews and fantasy film reviews, and we've also done a writing fantasy little mini series. There's 6 episodes of that, so check those out. And remember to keep it unreal, especially if you're grim.